If you want to learn how to make Minecraft animations like these, then you've come to the right place. Hello, I'm Utplank and I've been making Minecraft animations for over 7 years. In this tutorial series, I will be teaching you how to use Blender 4.0, which is completely free, and I will show you how to get started with making Minecraft animations. So first of all, what is Blender? Blender is a powerful, amazing, and free 3D software, which is used for many things such as 3D modeling, sculpting, VFX, rigging, animation, and so on. In this tutorial series, we will be focusing on the animation aspect of Blender, and specifically, we will be learning how to animate Minecraft characters, which are not complex and easy to move around. And they are a great way to start your 3D animation journey. We will also touch on the subjects of lighting, compositing, and rendering. Don't worry if you don't know what those are. I will be holding your hand throughout the series and explaining everything step by step. After you finish this tutorial, you will have a basic understanding of Blender, scene setup, lighting, animation, and rendering. And by the end of this series, we will create this animation inside our world. Pretty cool. So this tutorial series will have 5 parts in total. Let's break them down before we begin. In part 1, I will show you the basics of Blender and I will teach you how to navigate inside the software, how to create and move objects, how to organize your folders, and much more. In part 2, we will import our Minecraft world and our Minecraft character inside the Blender, and we will prepare to do the lighting. In part 3, we will light our scene and give it a cinematic look. In part 4, we will start animating the character and we will make this cool short animation. In part 5, I will show you how to add sounds and music to your animations to spice things up and improve your storytelling. Now, if you're excited, let's get started with part 1. So first, go to blender.org or click the link in the description, and then go to this download section. Download the latest version of Blender. By the time of recording this, the latest version is 4.01, but maybe you're watching this later and you'll have a newer version. Don't worry about it, just download the current version, which will be here. Also, if you're on Mac or Linux, you can click here and download any of these versions. Click on download Blender 4.01 and then wait for it to finish downloading and then also install it. I won't go through the installation process because it's pretty easy. Now that we've downloaded and installed Blender, let's talk about a very important topic: organizing. If your folders look like this, then... But if your folders look like this and they are neatly organized, well done, you have my respect and keep it up. So, why am I talking about folders? Because while you are making Minecraft animations and creating projects, you want to have your folders neatly organized. For example, here I have my Minecraft animations folder, and if I click on it, inside I have different folders. So I have folders specifically for HDR skies, items and blocks, maps, MC prep, mineways, and so on. And don't worry what those are, I will explain everything step by step. So, what I'm trying to say is, when you are creating projects, you want to have folders for every separate thing so that if you want to locate them later, you can go and choose them easily. And don't worry if you've never organized files for projects before, I will show you that as well and you can follow along. Now let's continue with the tutorial. Once you open Blender, you should see this menu. So if you want to choose the objects with the left click, then keep the left click enabled. Also, there are different themes you can choose from. For example, the default one is Blender Dark, but you can go for example for like Maya, or if you are a psychopath, then you can go to the light mode version. I'm just kidding, do whatever you want and use whichever version you feel comfortable with. Also, you can change them and customize them later, so don't overthink them. Choose whichever you want right now. I'm gonna stick with Blender Dark and I'm gonna keep the left click. And once we agree on that, we should see this. And then feel free to click on General. And then here we are. Welcome to the amazing world of Blender. Now, if it's your first time opening Blender and you get confused, I have one advice for you: don't get confused. But yeah, on a serious note, I will be explaining everything step by step, so don't worry. So, first thing you might notice is this 3D space right here, which is called the viewport, and we will spend the most of our time here. And here we have 3 objects, so this is a cube, we have a camera, and we have a point light as well. Now, let's talk about how to navigate around the 3D scene, which might be a tricky part for some newcomers, so let's cover that. I have enabled my screencast keys add-on so that you will be able to see what I'm clicking here in case you need to take a look. So, how do we move around the 3D scene? If you want to zoom in and out on an object, you can use your scroll wheel. So, scroll up is zoom in and scroll down is zoom out. If I want to rotate around the 3D scene and orbit around the objects, I can click and hold on my middle mouse, scroll wheel, and then I'm gonna rotate my mouse. So, gonna move either left or right, and then you can see I'm moving around the 3D scene. If I want to pan around, so if I want to go side by side, I can click on Shift and my middle mouse. And then you can see if I drag my mouse over either left or right, I'm panning around. I'm moving from side to side. So again, click on the middle mouse to rotate, zoom in and out, and then pan from side to side, which is pretty easy. Now let me show you how to select the objects. So since in the start screen, we selected the left click, then we can choose our objects with left click. So if I left click here, I can select my cube. If I left click on the point light, I select the point light, and same goes for the camera as well. Left click on the camera and I select the camera. As you can see, the selected objects have this orange outline here, and that's how you know they are selected. Also, if you are used to older versions of Blender like 2.7 and you want to keep the right click, then in the startup menu, you can choose the right click selection as well, or you can change it later in the preferences. I will show you that as well. Now let me show you how to select multiple objects, because sometimes we will need that as well. So we have our cube selected, right? And we want to select all the objects together. So if I shift and then left click on my point light, then you can see that both of my objects are selected. If I shift and then left click on my camera, I can select my camera as well, and I have all of my objects selected. If I want to deselect every object, I can click on Alt A. Now, what if you want to select all the objects together in your scene without selecting them one by one? You can do that by pressing A. If you press A, that selects everything, and Alt A deselects everything. Also, let's say I select all my objects, and let's say I accidentally deleted them, so I pressed the delete key. If I want to undo my last action, so in this case, if I want to bring my objects back, I can click on Ctrl Z. Ctrl Z is the undo in Blender, just like in many other software as well. Now I'll show you how to do the basic navigation, how to pan around, and how to select objects. But I will talk about the other view options as well, which might be important at times. So right now, we are looking at the default 3D view inside Blender, but Blender also has the orthographic view, which is like the 2D flat view, which is sometimes useful. So if I click on my numpad 5, I go inside this view, which gives it more like flat and wide look. But instead of 5, we will mostly be using numbers 1, 3, and 7 on the numpad. And let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to click on 5 again to go back to the default view. And if I click on 1, numpad 1, I go into front view, and it gives me this 2D look of the scene. And it's very handy sometimes if you want to select specific areas of an object or a character. If I click on 3, numpad 3, I go into the side view. If I click on numpad 7, I go to the top view. So again, 1 is the front view, 3 is the side view, 7 is the top view on the numpad. Also, if I want to go to the opposite directions, for example, if I want to go to the back view instead of the front view, then numpad 1 is the front view, and Control numpad 1 is the back view. Same goes for Control numpad 3, which is the left view instead of the right view, and Control numpad 7 is the bottom view instead of the top view. And if you want to exit this view, you can simply click on the middle mouse button and you're going to exit this view. Also, if you want to rotate around your scene using the middle mouse button, but you have a laptop trackpad and you don't use a mouse, first of all, and second of all, I'm just kidding, don't worry, you can use these tools over here. So if I click on the hand, if I click and hold on my mouse and drag, you can see that I'm panning around the scene. Same thing which we do with Shift and middle mouse button. And if I use these buttons, which are called gizmos, I can click on the middle, hold, and then I can move around. And as you can see, we're rotating and panning around the scene, just like we're doing with the middle mouse hold button. So you can use the hand tool and you can use these gizmos as well. Also, if you want to access the orthographic views, if you want to access the 2D views, then you can use these as well. So instead of holding them, you can just click on these points. So if I click on Z, I'm going to go into top view. X is going to be the front view and Y is going to be the side view. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. But if you don't have a numpad and you don't have a scroll wheel on your mouse, first of all, I highly recommend to get them if you want to get into 3D animations. But if you don't want to use these and you still want to use the shortcuts, then there is a way to change that as well. So if you go into Edit and Preferences on the top left corner, then I can go into the key map. And then first of all, right here, you're able to change the selection method. So if you're more comfortable with using like older versions of Blender, like 2.78 and below, then you might be used to the right click selection. So you can choose that here as well. Also, if we go into the input and we check emulate numpad and emulate 3-button mouse. Now these will give us different options. So if I'm not mistaken, emulate 3-button mouse basically does this. If you click on Alt and then left click, let me minimize this so you will be able to see better. So if I click on Alt and then left click, so let's say you don't have a middle mouse, then you can do Alt and left click and rotate around the same, just like you would do with the middle mouse scroll wheel. And also we did emulate the numpad as well. So what this does is, if you don't have a numpad, if your keyboard doesn't have a separate numpad, then once you enable this, you will be able to use the numbers on your keyboard, on top of your keyboard, like you would use the numpad. So if I click on 1 on my keyboard, that's front view, this says numpad 1, but I'm actually clicking on top of my keyboard. And then 3 on my keyboard is the side view, 7 is the top view. So that's how you can enable these shortcuts. But for now, I'm going to disable them because I have the numpad and I have the mouse as well. And I recommend you get that as well if you don't have it. Now that you know how to navigate around the scene, I would recommend to practice this. Just open up Blender file and practice navigation. And after that, let's learn how to move the objects inside the Blender, because that's a very important part if you want to do animations. So let me first delete my camera and my point light because I will not need them. So if I select my camera and then I click on X, I can click on delete. Another way of deleting objects is if I select my point light, I can just click on delete and that's it. So now we're left with this cube. Let's learn how to move objects inside the Blender, and I'm going to demonstrate it by using this default cube. And I'm not going to delete the default cube. A running joke inside the Blender community is that you always delete the default cube and create a new one, but let's not delete this for now. So select the cube, and then right here we have the side panel. If you don't see it, for example, if it's like this, you can press on this arrow to bring it up. Also, the shortcut to bring out the side panel is T. So if I click on T, I can bring it out. If I click on T, I can make it disappear. So if I bring out the sidebar, I can see that we have different buttons here. The main ones we will need are this, which is called move. This one is called rotate, and this one is called scale. So if I click on the move tool, you can see that different gizmos appear here. We have like top, which is the Z-axis, Y-axis arrow, and then X-axis arrow. And Blender has 3 dimensions. So basically, the red line here is the X-axis, green line is the Y, and the Z is, I believe, the purple one, but it's not visible on the default. You can enable that, but it's distracting and most people don't enable it. But even though in math, Y-axis is the top one, in Blender, you can remember that Z-axis is the one that goes from top to bottom. So we have these 3 different axes. So if I left click and hold my mouse and then I drag my cube, you can see that I'm moving my cube on the Y-axis, which is this green line. So I can release it and release it in a new position. Same goes for the red. If I click on this, I can move my cube on the X-axis and I can move my cube on the Y-axis as well. So click here, drag it up or down. And it's that easy to move around the objects. So I'm going to Control Z multiple times until I get my cube in the starting position. And yeah, I showed you how to enable the move tool. Now, the second thing we will be using is the rotation. So if I click on rotate, you can see the gizmos change. If I click and hold on the red and then move it down or up, you can see that I'm rotating my cube around the X-axis. Now the same goes for the green and blue axis. So if I click on the green one, I can rotate my cube on the Y-axis and I can rotate my cube on the Z-axis as well, like this. And also if I click in the middle, I'm going to be able to free rotate this cube anywhere I want. Now I'm going to Control Z multiple times as well. And let's show you the third option. Now this third option is important, but we will not be using that often in animation. We will mostly be using move and rotate, but I'm going to show you the third one as well, which is scale. In Blender, you are able to change the scale, aka the size of your objects. So you can see our gizmos changed again. If I click on this white circle, if I click, hold and drag, you can see that my cube is changing size. So if I move it up, you can see my cube is increasing in size. And if I do it separately, so if I move my mouse in, the cube is getting smaller. So I can make it bigger like this, and I can make it smaller like this. Also, I can scale my cube on different axes. So if I click here, it's going to scale on X-axis, then Y-axis, and Z-axis as well. So that's how you move, rotate, and scale your objects inside the Blender. But if you want to get good at Blender, and if you want to be cool, then I recommend you to get used to the shortcuts and hotkeys. Let me Control Z multiple times again, and I'll show you a faster and more efficient way to move the objects. We can click here to make all the gizmos disappear. Click on the select box. I can click on T to make the sidebar go away. And then I'm going to show you how you can move objects faster. First, we discussed the location. So if you want to change the location of the cube, you can press on G. You can remember this by G for grab. If I grab my cube, you can see that I'm moving it around. If I want to release it in a new position, I can do left click. Again, move it with G and then left click. Move it and then left click. If I move my cube and I don't want to do that operation, I can do the right click and it's going to snap it back to its previous place. Again, G is basically moving it freely. But what if I want to move my cube around on the specific axis? I can do that by pressing G and then choosing either X, Y, or Z. So if I want to move my cube up and down, I can press on G and then Z. And then it's going to only snap on one place. And I can move my cube up, for example. If I want to move it on X axis, I can press on G and then X. And same goes for Y. G, Y, it moves on the Y axis. Now, if you're a beginner, feel free to practice with these arrows as well, but you can use this method as well, which most people use. Now, let me show you another way of moving around the cube as well. So press on G for grab, and then if I click and hold on my middle mouse, and then I, for example, move it on the right side, on the Y axis, it's gonna snap it only on the Y axis. And then if I click on G and then middle mouse and then move it down, you can see that it only snaps on one axis. I like this method a lot. So if I press on G and then hold my middle mouse and I want to move this on the X axis, I'm going to hold my middle mouse and then move the cube right on this line. And it's that easy to move the cube. Now, what if you don't like the location? For example, I moved my cube here and I want to return it to its original place. So I want to return it here. Then what we can do is press Alt and then G. So Alt is basically resetting either the location, rotation, or even scale. Now that we've learned how to move the cube with G, let's discuss rotation. Rotation hotkey is pretty easy to remember as well. If I press on R to rotate, I can rotate my cube around like this. If I press on RX, I can rotate it around X, and same goes for Z and then Y axis as well. What if I want to free rotate my cube? If I press on R and then R again, so RR, I can move my cube freely. And I use this method personally very often while making Minecraft animations because it allows me to rotate my object pretty quickly. So if I do the left click, I can release it in a new position. If I do the right click, I cancel the movement. And if I want to return my cube to the starting place, starting pose, then I click on Alt R and it's going to reset or clear the rotation. Now let's discuss the scale as well. So we can change the scale by pressing S. S for scale. So if I press on S and bring my mouse out or in, I can change the size. If I press on SX, I'm going to scale only on the X axis. If I press on SY, I'm going to scale on the Y axis. And if I press on SC, I can make my cube taller or shorter. So I'm going to scale on the Y axis. Also, if I want to return it to the starting scale, again, Alt S, and then the cube returns to the starting position. So I recommend to exercise with these. You can either use like G method, middle mouse method, or you can use like GX, GY. Or if that's too hard for you, then you can press on T and then practice with these. So you can enable these arrows and then learn how to move the objects. And I recommend doing that for like 10 to 15 minutes to practice and get very, very comfortable. I recommend to practice moving around as well. So like middle mouse, rotate, shift, pan around, and so on. And now that you know how to navigate around the scene, let's change some preferences inside Blender to make our lives easier. So if I click on Edit, and then Preferences, we can change different preferences here. I won't change too much so that I don't confuse you. So first, let's go into the system and let's talk about rendering. So if I click on System, I have different options to choose here. By default, Blender should be rendering with the CPU, aka Central Processing Unit. But you want to change this to your GPU because it renders a lot faster. So if you have a graphics card, you can choose one of these options. So if you have an NVIDIA GTX card, you can choose CUDA. If you have NVIDIA RTX card, you can choose Optics. And if you have an AMD card, I believe you can choose this option, which is HIP. So I have a GTX 1660 and I'm going to click on CUDA. And then you can see my NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1660 is enabled. Now, if you have RTX, again, you can click on Optics, which is a way faster rendering. And HIP is for AMD video cards as well. Now I have NVIDIA GTX 1660. So CUDA, NVIDIA GTX 1660, enable the GPU. Now over here on memory and limits, we have the undo steps and it says 32. So you're able to undo your last action 32 times. So you can press Ctrl Z 32 times, but I have it all the way up, which is like 256. So if you click and hold your mouse and then drag this on the right side, you can see that I'm increasing this number. If I drag it on the left, I can make it 0, but you know, everybody wants to undo their last actions, so you can increase it all the way. I have it all the way up because why not? So on the system, that's all we need. We need to enable our graphics card and we can increase the undo steps as well. Now let's go to key map. So on key map, we want to change a few settings. So if I search for fly, we have this shift tilde for fly. But the easier method to do is the Shift F method. So if I left click here, I can do Shift F, and now I have it set as Shift F. And the fly method is very useful in terms of navigation. You can click on Shift F and then you can move around like you would move around in a video game, basically. And I will show you that as well in a bit. The second thing we need is frame selected. So search for frame selected. Make sure you're in the key map, name, and then search for frame selected. And on the 3D view, where it says on the third row, it says numpad period. I recommend to left click and change it to F. And I will show you that in a bit. I will show you what that does in a bit as well. So we mainly want to change these settings. And also we want to change this in a graph editor. So when we're in a graph editor, we can left click and then change it to an F. So make sure it's set to F on 3D view and in the graph editor as well. And also Blender has some add-ons which basically speed up our workflow and make our lives easier. So let's go into add-ons and then search for Node Wrangler. So I'm going to type Node Wrangler and then enable this Node Wrangler add-on. And it's going to come in handy in the future episodes where we're going to do the lighting and all the compositing and so on. So enable this. That's all we need for now. We're going to download a few add-ons in the future episodes, but for now, that's all we need. Now click on Save the Preferences, but by default, you should have Autosave Preferences enabled. But still, click on Save Preferences and turn it off. Now, if you remember, we changed Shift tilde to Shift F. If I click on Shift F in my viewport, Shift F, and then you can see I'm entering this view. When I'm moving my mouse, it moves like this. Now, this view allows us to move in Blender like we would move in a video game. So if I press on WASD, as you can see, I am moving around. If I press on Q and E, I can move up and down. If I press on Shift and then W, I can move faster. And then I can use my mouse to basically rotate. And as you can see, it's a pretty useful way to navigate around the scene. Shift S makes me move back and Shift W makes me move forward faster. Also, another way to go faster is if I click on W and then I use my scroll wheel to scroll up. As you can see, if I scroll up, I'm going fast. If I scroll down, I'm gonna go a lot slower. And Shift F is very useful, especially when you're in the camera view. You can use Shift F to move around in the camera, and I'm going to show you that as well in a few seconds. Also, another thing we enabled, if you remember, we changed frame select from numpad period to F. Let's say I'm working on the scene and I'm very far away to this cube. If I select my cube and I left click, I can press on F, and then it's going to jump me in front of this cube. And then when I orbit around the scene, you can see that it orbits around the cube easily. So again, if I'm far away to the scene, I can select this, click on F, and it's gonna zoom on the cube and I can rotate it around pretty easily. And also, let me show you how to create new objects, new things in Blender, and let me show you how you can enter and exit the camera view, because that's important as well in terms of animation. So I'm gonna deselect the cube first, so Shift A. Now we can create objects in Blender by either coming here and clicking on Add, and we have different things to create, or the shortcut for it is Shift A. So Shift A, and then if I go down here where it says camera, I left click and then I create a new camera, but we cannot see it because it's right behind this cube. If I want to move my camera out, I can press on G and then move it somewhere over here. Now, if you remember, numpad was useful to move around the scene with like 1, 3, and 7. And if I click on numpad 0, I go inside this camera view. Now I'm looking at the scene from my camera. And if I click on Shift F, I can rotate and move my camera just like we did with the WASD method. So I'm clicking WASD, Q and E, and I can move my camera. And if I left click, I'm gonna place my camera in a new position. But if I start moving and I don't like this new position, I can right click to cancel the movement. So you can Shift F, move it closer, move the camera outwards, and let's place the camera somewhere over here. If you want to exit the camera view, you can press on 0, and then it's gonna exit the camera view. Also, if you want to exit the camera view, you can click on the scroll wheel, and that's it. You exited the camera view. Now that we know how to navigate around the scene, how to move the objects and so on, let's talk about the different panels here, which might come in handy in the future. So right here on top, we have different panels. As you can see, we have like layout, modeling, sculpting, and UV editing, and there are a lot more. So the main ones we will be using is layout, and we will spend like most of our time here. Also, we will be using animation in the future. So if I click on animation, as you can see, my screens are changed. They are rearranged in different order. Right, we have these different panels over here. And if I click on compositing, I'm gonna go into compositing panel, and we will use that in the future episodes as well. So we will need to know animation, compositing, but we don't need to know them like in depth. We just need to know the basics of how to use them. Animation, compositing, and also layout. So these three will be the main ones we will be using while making Minecraft animations. So let's go back to the layout here, and then I'm gonna explain these side panels as well. So right here we have the outliner. In the outliner, we are able to organize different objects and characters and so on. So as you can see, this says scene collection, and under here we have collection. And collections are basically like folders where you are able to organize different objects. So let's create a point light. So I'm going to click on Shift A and then go to light and then point. We have 4 different lights to choose from, and I'm going to create a point light because that's what we had in the default view. So let's make this look like we have just opened Blender. So I believe we had something like this. I'm doing this because I want to organize the importance of collections and importance of like organizing our files from the outliner. So the first thing you might have noticed here is we have these names and objects. So we have camera with the camera icon, cube, and then point. Basically what we see here is also what we see here, but then in the text format. So if I'm lost in a scene, for example, if I'm somewhere here and I want to go in front of my cube and I cannot find it, the reason outliner is useful is because I can left click on my cube. So basically my cube is selected, and it's also selected in the 3D viewport as well. So if I click on F, as you can see, I can jump in front of my cube. And same thing goes for the camera. I can select my camera over here, and I can select my point light. And also, if I select my cube, it's going to be selected in the outliner as well. While you're working on Minecraft animation projects, you want to have different folders here. For example, you're going to have different objects folder or collection. You're going to have like characters collection. You're going to have like item collection, and you're going to have like lights collection and so on. So let's practice creating different collections here, and feel free to follow along because this is a very important step to organize your folders. The way we create new collections is if I right click somewhere here on this empty area, and then I click on new collection, I have collection 2, but we want to name our collection so that it's more organized. So if I double click on this and name this something like camera collection, you can see that I created a new camera collection. So if I want to move my camera inside this new collection, there are 2 ways. One is I can left click, select my camera, and then left click and drag it inside the camera collection and then release it. And now I have my camera inside this camera collection, and I can disable this, and then I hide the camera that way. Also, if I click on this, I bring my camera back. Let me show you another way of moving an object into a new collection. If I'm inside my 3D view, and I select my camera with left click, I can press on M, and you can see we have different collections over here. So if I press on this camera collection, which I just created, or I can also create a new collection, which is going to appear here later. So if I press on M and then camera collection, it's going to move inside the camera collection as well. Now let's practice and let's do the same for the cube. So select the cube, create a new collection, name this cube collection, or let's type this something like objects collection. I can left click on the cube, M, and then move inside the objects collection. And let's do the same for the point light. And for the point light, let's create something like lights collection. Right click, new collection, double click on this to rename it lights collection. And then if I left click M and then lights collection, I can move it here. But let's use the previous method, which is drag and drop it here. And now if I want to minimize these folders, I can click here separately, or I can just click on them together. So if I left click and drag my mouse down, it's going to minimize them together. If I left click and then drag down, it's going to extend them. So let's minimize them, and you can see how organized and clean they are. So if I want to, for example, find my camera, I have my camera collection over here. I can extend this, left click, and then select my camera and move in front of my camera. If I want to hide my collections, I can press this and drag down or drag up, and it's going to either hide or reveal the collections. Also, I didn't show you how to hide the objects inside the viewport. So if I'm working on a scene and I want to get rid of this cube temporarily, I can press on H, and then it's going to hide the object. If I press on Alt H, it's going to bring it back. And it's that easy. Now that I showed you how to organize different collections, let's go down here. Now, down here we have different properties. These sections are called the properties. But for now, you don't have to know all of them. I'm going to show you the different properties and what they are basically. I'm going to explain them, and we're going to change a few settings here as well. But it won't be too much information, so don't worry. Now, if I click here on this TV icon, this is called Render Properties. And right here, it says EV, and we have 64 and 16 samples on the sampling tab. Now, let me talk about the different render engines inside Blender. So Blender has EV and cycles. And there's also Workbench, but Workbench is not used for final renders. Now I'm going to talk about EV and cycles. So EV, which is the default when we open up Blender, is the real-time render engine. It renders pretty fast, it renders in real time, but the thing is, it's not as realistic and as high quality as cycles. So EV renders fast, but it doesn't have any like realistic reflections or shadows, but you can still fake some stuff and make it close to cycles. And you can use it in your animations as well if you have a weaker PC, for example. Even if you have a strong PC and you prefer EV, then you can go for that as well. But for this tutorial, we're going to be going with cycles. Now, cycles is way more realistic render engine. There's a lot of technical stuff involved here as well. But to explain this easily, cycles is basically way more realistic, but it takes way longer to render. It doesn't support like real-time rendering. You can render it in real time, but it's going to take a lot longer to load. And also, when you export the animation and in the final render. So for example, if I have a Minecraft scene rendered in EV, it might take 5 to 10 seconds. But in cycles, the same scene might take like 3, 4, or even more minutes depending. So basically, EV is real time and it's pretty fast, and in cycles takes way longer, but it's more realistic. For this tutorial, we'll be using cycles. Now under here, as you can see, we have CPU. But since in the preferences earlier, we enabled our GPU, our graphics card, then we can click on device and then GPU compute. Now, if you don't see these options, or this option is like dark here, then you didn't enable your GPU from the preferences, or you don't have a GPU in your laptop or your PC. So you might be using CPU as well. So if you have a CPU and you don't have a graphics card, I recommend switching to EV because it's easier to work in. But for those of you who enable GPU, click on cycles and then click on GPU over here, so that in the final render, we will be rendering with our GPU. Now let's go down here and we have sampling. We have viewport sampling and we have render sampling. Now these numbers are way too high and we don't need to use them that high. And basically to explain samples is that the more samples you have, the better your scene looks, but you don't want to go way higher. So less samples means basically your image is going to be noisy, it's not going to be high quality. More samples mean your image is going to be cleaner, more high quality. And for the viewport, we don't need like 1024. We can click and choose like 4. And then I chose 4 and then I basically left click outside of it, or you can click on enter to confirm it. Let's go down to render, and for now, let's choose max samples and let's type something like 20 for now. And in the future, we're going to increase it, but for now, we just need 20 and press on enter. And over here, as you can see, we have this denoise option, and be sure it's checked on. Denoising basically makes the image cleaner and it gets rid of all the noises. So this is basically all we need to know for now about the render engines and render properties. But under here, we need to change one more thing. We have light paths over here. So left click on that to expand this menu. Also, if you want to minimize the sampling, we can just click on this and it's going to minimize the sampling. And we're going to extend the light paths. Under here, we have reflective and refractive caustics. We don't need them to be enabled in Minecraft animations. So they're going to increase render time and the quality is not going to be a lot higher. So it's not worth our render time. So we're going to click on these and then disable the reflective and refractive caustics. And then you can minimize them as well. And that's all we need to know for now. But in the future, we're going to come back to the render properties because it's very important to know some of the settings. But for now, keep these settings. Yeah, then come down here. And this is the output properties. So here we see we have 24 FPS. If you're familiar with video games, you know what FPS is. We have the resolution of the final image, which is 1920 by 1080. So we can keep 1920 by 1080, which is like HD and standard today. In the past, 720p was HD. We often use 720p, but you know, it's no longer considered HD. So let's use 1920 by 1080 by default. And frame rate, I recommend to change it to 30 FPS. So click on this and choose 30. You can keep 24. But 24 FPS is mostly used for like films, and 30 FPS is mostly used for like YouTube videos and basic like internet content and so on. So you can click on 30 FPS, choose it, and I use 30 FPS and a lot of other people use 30 frames per second as well. Right here we have frame start and then step. And these things are basically the same that are here. We have start and step. Step means which frame we're currently on. But I'm going to explain those in detail in the animation chapter, which is going to be part 4, so don't worry about those for now. And then right here, all we need to change is basically the frame rate. So we chose 30 FPS, and then we'll change these things later. Right here on the third section, we have a view layers, and we can enable different layers so that we can work on these with the compositing in the lighting episode. So for now, we don't need to enable any of these. So I'm just going to leave this here for now. Right here, we have the world properties. We're going to come back to the world properties as well. And we have the material properties. And this material properties appear only when you select a certain object. I'm going to show you an example. So if I select my point light, this option is going to disappear. Instead, I'm going to get this new lighting option. If I select my cube and left click, you can see that the material options appear again. Now, we don't need to change any materials or colors for now. This is like an introduction episode. I'm mainly showing you how to navigate, move around, move the objects, and change different settings. So for now, we're not going to be needing this. So we can leave it like this. And let's go back to the render properties. And for now, these are all the settings we need to change for now. As you can see, we changed a few settings, and if we close this, our changes will not be saved. And we want to keep these changes all the time we open Blender, right? And also one more change I recommend is if I go down here on this panel, this is a timeline section. So if I move my mouse on the edge, I get these arrows. So if I left click and drag up, I can extend this layer. I recommend to keep it somewhere over this size, or choose a size which you're comfortable with. The default one right here is pretty hard to see, so extend your timeline and leave it like this. And also I recommend to choose the start frame to 0. So I can either use this to make it 0, or I can just type here, type 0, and then left click and move this to 0 as well. And now I changed all of these settings and I want to keep them every time I open Blender. If I close this, the changes will not be saved. So what you can do is click on File and then Defaults. And then I can click on Save Startup File. And then I click on this again. So left click. And then now if I close Blender and open it, I'm going to be greeted with everything that we changed. So we're going to have these collections. We're going to have these settings the same. So basically we're going to have like reflective and refractive turned off. We're going to have 0 as a starting frame. And it's pretty useful. So that concludes part 1 of our series. In the second part, we will import our world and our character inside Blender, and we will set up our scene as well. So on this first part, I showed you how to navigate inside Blender, how to move around, how to move your objects, how to create and delete objects, and we also changed some preferences and our settings to make our lives easier and make our workflow a lot faster. And I also showed you different panels and settings, and now after this, you will be ready for part 2. Thank you for watching this episode. If you want to support this channel and get cool rewards, then you can check out my Patreon page linked in the description. And if you finished watching this, well done on following and congratulations on taking the first step into the 3D animation journey. If you're watching this by the time it's uploaded, then part 2 will come out soon. But if you're watching this a bit later, then you can click on the screen and you will be able to jump into part 2. So see you there.